using generative AI to build a donor report that matches a specific funder's template. So like the budget actuals, the qualitative assessment, the activity and milestone progress, the indicator results. And ultimately, this is kind of work that program teams have historically spent days, weeks, sometimes months developing. I think the question to ask yourself as an organization is, does the contract with the AI software vendor comply with local, regional, and international or organizational standards?
You're listening to The Nonprofit Boost, where Double the Donation and industry leaders share practical tips to help you grow revenue and boost corporate fundraising at your nonprofit.
Welcome back to the Nonprofit Boost podcast by Double the Donation. We are diving into a topic that is everywhere right now in the nonprofit sector. Development teams are stretched thin and adopting generative AI to save time and increase capacity. But without clear guardrails, this rush to automate can create real risks, from eroding donor trust and exposing sensitive data to putting corporate partnerships in a difficult legal position. Joining me today to cut through the hype is Katrina Seidel from Vera Solutions. Katrina is the Chief Growth Officer at Vera Solutions, a leading tech for good partner and certified B corporation that helps impact-driven organizations unlock the full potential of their data. Prior to Vera, Katrina worked extensively in international development, including co-founding a social enterprise supporting ethical work for Congolese refugees. In today's episode, we're tackling the fine line between AI efficiency and authentic donor engagement. We'll break down actionable frameworks leaders can implement right away to innovate with confidence while keeping relationships front and center. Katrina, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Right, I think we can definitely jump right into the question. So AI has absolutely dominated the nonprofit tech conversation lately, but usually in the context of very flashy, futuristic use cases. But to ground us today, what is the most surprisingly effective yet completely unglamorous way that you've seen a nonprofit utilize AI recently that actually delivered real business value?
I think this is something that's been surprisingly effective in what we've seen in our work across 450 organizations and really kind of digging into this AI space now. I think the unglamorous adjective might be a bit debatable, particularly because for me, as someone who's worked kind of at the intersection of technology and social impact for the last 8 years, I probably find some of these kind of unglamorous opportunities highly glamorous because they're really saving the sector time and headaches. But one, I would say, surprisingly effective use case that we've seen support the sector and really kind of help to build upon some of the 16 years of work that we at Vera have been doing to amplify the impact of the sector is using generative AI to build a donor report that matches a specific funder's template. So like the budget actuals, the qualitative assessment, the activity and milestone progress, the indicator results. And ultimately, this is kind of work that program teams have historically spent days, weeks, sometimes months developing. And what we've seen is nonprofits using an LLM, connecting it via MCPs. I'll unpack that because it might be a term that we use a little bit more in this, but MCPs stand for Model Context Protocols for those who are unfamiliar. And really, it's just kind of an open standard that powers interactive tool support and helps kind of connect the apps and technologies that you're already using to bring that data directly inside your LLM chat. So through these kind of connections, we've seen LLMs kind of pull together a donor report. So kind of supporting the project or program budget actuals from one system, the indicator results sitting in Excel or Kobo or Salesforce, and they have impact, and assembling kind of a first pass of the report, which is saving the sector, I would say, an enormous amount of time and kind of ultimately freeing people up to do a bit more kind of augmentation with AI. So more of the critical thinking, the program analysis, the work that kind of improves outcomes. Yeah, I think we've been in conversations with various organizations and seen this in practice and have a cool demo as well that we're happy to share at any time for those that might find it useful. Ultimately, I would say is like we unpack this further. We run AI peer learning groups with the sector more broadly. And as we unpack this in those discussions, I would say it's kind of the where AI earns and keeps its kind of trust is in repetitive, low-risk tasks first. And that's kind of the place where a lot of nonprofits are getting started. It's one of our kind of core guidelines for the sector is really like pinpoint where it lifts a workload or accelerates a process that's already well understood and already has the kind of right data pipelines underlying it and will save time and headaches ultimately. We've also kind of built an ROI framework around this and have a calculator that kind of helps make these decisions and help to kind of identify what those effective use cases might be. That looks at how much time and money does it cost today? How much will AI help? So looking at like expected time savings, expected quality improvement. Thirdly, what will it cost to implement? Fourthly, how will it advance your mission, which kind of builds out a mission impact score. Fifth one is how will it change your team's capacity? So building out kind of that capacity impact score and then layering on top of that kind of a risk level and applying that as a discount to really spit out an overall recommendation. So that's also can be helpful, I would say, in identifying like for you as an organization or a nonprofit, what might be kind of the most effective at this point in time and might not be something that's kind of big and glamorous that you have on your radar.
I think that perspective is really great, Katrina, because like AI earning its keep on the repetitive, low-risk tasks first, I think that really reframes the narrative from replacing fundraisers to really empowering fundraisers. But as we start leaning on these tools for more strategic work, we hit a new ethical friction point. Trust is, of course, the absolute bedrock of philanthropy. And today's donors, especially millennials, especially Gen Z, they demand radical transparency. If a major donor or a corporate sponsor discovers that their deeply personalized stewardship report was actually drafted by an algorithm, or it can actually kind of push the relationship into this kind of uncanny valley where the connection feels artificial. So let's talk about the ethical line of disclosure in fundraising. If a nonprofit is using AI tools to segment high net worth individuals or draft kind of like initial corporate sponsorship pitches, do we need to explicitly disclose that an AI was involved? Or is this just the new normal for modern businesses?
Great question that we're receiving from a lot of nonprofits in the work that we're doing. I want to ground it in our Vera kind of 9 principles of responsible AI. And this is kind of a set of criteria that we've developed that we're kind of looking at as it relates to AI decisions for nonprofits are making within their organization. One of those criteria is transparency and explainability. And ultimately, that's kind of being transparent about where AI or how AI is used and making it understandable for stakeholders are really kind of the 2 pillars of ethical and responsible AI. In a social impact context, I think this clarity is especially important since, as you mentioned, trust forms the bedrock of relationships with donors, beneficiaries, partners. You could kind of extend that beyond as well. Within Vera ourselves, our guidelines state where AI has materially contributed to a deliverable, that contribution should be disclosed to clients, stakeholders, or internal teams as appropriate. And that's kind of within our own AI policy. I think in this particular case that you shared, it's ultimately disclosure is a trust preservation strategy, and that being kind of the trust being the greatest currency of our age, and certainly in this sector as well. The distinction that we draw is between kind of firstly kind of AI drafting documents and use as an analysis tool versus AI as a decision maker or a relationship substitute. And I think if a gift officer uses AI to help segment a major donor list based on giving history and capacity indicators, or to even get to a first draft of sponsorship pitch, kind of to get the pitch off of a blank page, I think that's comparable to using a CRM's predictive scoring or having another colleague or an associate draft a template. Nobody would really expect kind of this was assisted by software disclosure for something like that. And I think demanding something like that for every AI touch draft sets kind of an unworkable and somewhat arbitrary standard that we're still trying to figure out within the sector as well. I'd say where this potentially changes in how we would think about this is if the donor or corporate partner would really reasonably assume they're getting something more personal or more kind of human vetted than they actually are. So if the personal note, in quotes here, referencing like their daughter's soccer team or the customized ask amount was generated with minimal human judgment in the loop. I think non-disclosure starts to shade a bit into deception, even if it's unintentional. And I think the test here isn't necessarily kind of, was AI involved? I think it's really like, would this relationship feel different to the donor if they knew how the sausage was getting made? If it's yes, then I think your signal to either add a human layer of review or personalization or just be transparent about it. Practically, I think we can probably dissect this into two things. The first is disclosure obligation scales with personalization claims. So segmented mailing list probably wouldn't need a disclosure, whereas like something that's handwritten and meant to be that from an executive director might. The second one I think is even more important, and this is really just that the internal policy is probably more important than the donor-facing disclosure in most cases. So the biggest risk here isn't necessarily that the donor finds out that AI helped produce it. It's ultimately, I would say, like a gift officer using an ungoverned tool with sensitive donor data or an AI drafted pitch that contains errors in it that nobody caught because we thought it was just a draft or whatnot. And ultimately, I think kind of tying back to Vera's 9 principles, which I'll continue to do just because it helps to kind of frame some of the discussion for us. It leans hard on the human in the loop and the data governance for kind of specifically this region. I think the ethical line is really less about disclosure and more about making kind of sure a human is still accountable for what goes out the door. And I think ultimately that kind of aligns to, we've built a little bit of a AI readiness framework that looks at kind of the baseline being a values aligned charter, data pipeline readiness, so making sure that you have kind of the context for use cases, then moving into prioritized use cases, thirdly, fourthly, building out an implementation roadmap, and fifthly, looking at kind of change management and feedback. And I think this question really kind of veers into the use case prioritization as like the third cog on that wheel. I think it's where we've seen the impact sector the social impact kind of space, and where we can have kind of the most impact on the sector is helping organizations kind of look at and prioritize those use cases and help identify kind of what might be the right tools and how might you approach actually kind of the build within AI or leveraging AI and other technologies. And I think we'll still have to continue to prioritize and dig into these questions as they come up.
Nonprofits are always being asked to do more with limited time and resources. Double the Donations virtual summits offer practical insights, expert advice, and actionable ideas to help you grow your impact. Check out the summit calendar and register at doubletheDonation.com/virtual-summits. We'll see you there.
Katrina, I think that's a brilliant distinction, drawing like a firm line between AI acting as a backstage drafting assistant versus AI acting as a frontline decision maker. And you are so right that there should always be a human element before anything goes out of the door. But of course, to do any of that internal drafting or decision making, these AI tools, they require fuel. And that fuel is our data. And in the nonprofit sector, donor data isn't just a list of names. It's a highly sensitive information regarding wealth capacity, giving history, and corporate affiliations. So how do you advise organizations to leverage AI for prospect research or database analytics without accidentally feeding proprietary sensitive donor data into a public learning?
I'd say the risk here is what to look at is really actually the data architecture. And I think that's the greatest risk here, more so than the AI tool itself. So the question that we'd likely recommend nonprofits to ask is, where is your data going when you hit kind of generate or when you're plugging it into whatever tool you're using? If you're pasting a donor's wealth screening output into a free consumer-facing chatbot to help you write a pitch, for instance, it's really the equivalent of handing a third party's proprietary data and ultimately kind of your donor's sensitive financial profile into a system that could be training on it, storing it, or surfacing it elsewhere. And that's ultimately kind of how a lot of consumer AI tools work by default, whether that's kind of widely known or not. So I think the first thing we tell organizations is to separate the capability from the tool. So AI-assisted prospect research is a use case that certainly can be incredibly valuable. I think like the pattern recognition across giving history, identifying capacity indicators, surfacing corporate affiliations, these can all be identified through safe AI practices. And we really only recommend that you do so within an environment that's with an enterprise data agreement. So something where you know contractually that your inputs aren't training a public model and aren't leaving your control. And ultimately, I think it's why building an initial values-aligned charter, as we kind of, as I just previously shared a little bit around that kind of AI readiness model, and then selecting the right tools are kind of the most important groundwork that a nonprofit can do. There's many tools that, like Claude for Nonprofits, for as an example, the enterprise account, they prohibit data training by default. And there are other tools that, particularly I would say kind of like free consumer accounts that require you to manually kind of go find the privacy toggle and turn training off. And it's not automatically gonna prohibit that. I'd say this sort of example is probably why we anchor any advice, again, around these 9 principles, is ultimately kind of don't leak donor data is, it sounds obvious, I would say, until there's members of your team who are leveraging various fundraising tools and might be leveraging some shadow IT tools here and there hasn't necessarily been a broader kind of data mapping exercise that's taken place where you kind of mapped how the data flows, and it's hard to understand kind of how something like this could escalate. I think there's probably four different areas to consider here. In this example, the first one is privacy and data protection. So are you collecting only what you need? Is sensitive data protected appropriately? Are you following the regulations that apply to you? The second one is robustness and security. Is there a plan to monitor how the AI performs under real conditions? And are you prepared for misuse or failure? Thirdly is accountability and governance. Who's responsible ultimately for the ethical and effective use of AI in your organization? And is there a team reviewing AI generated outputs? I think in fundraising specifically, that means someone owns the answer to what tool touches what data as well. And then finally, transparency and explainability. We already talked about accountability, would be the fourth. And that kind of loops back to the disclosure conversation we were just having of, can you explain where AI touched their journey? If you can't explain it simply, it's usually a sign you haven't thought through kind of that data flow. I think there's a lot of hype, and I can understand the excitement to get started and save time. But ultimately, I would say one of probably the best things that a nonprofit can do is kind of lean on support in developing the governance layer and mapping where sensitive data lives, and selecting the right tools with the right data agreements in place, and ultimately training the gift officers and prospect researchers on responsible use. So we certainly wouldn't want the excitement about the capability to outpace our certainty about the tool that it's running on, and getting the data agreement right first is going to kind of ultimately lead to great data segmentation and output drafting and kind of generating insights that will follow.
Yeah, I think you hit on something so critical there, being aware of the regulations of LLMs or the AI that you're using, and really taking that extra step to ensure that donor data is safe. But I especially also liked how you mentioned that there should be accountability. And that's something that should never be, I guess, forgotten, especially in the nonprofit sector. However, I also wanted to kind of bring up that for a very stretched thin fundraising team dealing with massive databases, the temptation to ignore that and put donor communications on total autopilot is very, very huge. That excitement that you've mentioned earlier. And as someone who consults on tech adoption, what does a realistic, efficient, human-in-the-loop workflow actually look like for a corporate partnerships manager trying to save time without losing their authentic voice?
Autopilot's it's a big word, I would say. And I think if we reframe that a bit, or reframe maybe like the mental model of how we're thinking about that, I think autopilot implies that the plane flies itself and you just kind of watch it fly. And ultimately, I think that's not necessarily the output we want to get to here. And it's not what saves maybe a corporate partnerships manager time either. Kind of as we were just discussing, there's other elements that if we don't have that human in the loop, the moment something goes out that sounds off, or worse, gets a fact wrong about a donor's giving history or whatnot, we've actually just created hours of cleanup and a bit more of a trust problem, kind of back to trust as that greatest currency. I think we can think about it really though, like the best alternative maybe to autopilot is a co-pilot. And I think Microsoft cleverly capitalized on this phrase by calling their LLM co-pilot. But AI can handle the altitude. If we think about this in an analogy here with a plane, AI can handle the altitude and the direction, which we can consider like the repetitive structural stuff. As we were discussing previously as well. And ultimately, the human's hands are still on the controls for anything that touches judgment or taste or relationship. So I think it could break down as kind of, firstly, AI drafts the skeleton. So the meeting recap, the first pass of the thank you note, a template, pitch, pulling in the partner's giving history and past engagement, and kind of gets it to a V1. The second step would be the human checks the facts. So did the AI get the partnership tier right, the renewal date, the name of the person who approved last year's sponsorship, kind of those details that sit across various systems. I think they inject one or two personal details that really make it theirs. So that inside joke from the site visit or a specific thing they said. And thinking again kind of about our ROI framework with this. Ultimately, even these two steps are likely reducing the time from 30 minutes to 5 minutes, which is helpful which is certainly helpful, I would say, for the team. Thirdly, then, I think anything with financial asks, like so sensitive relationship history or a first touch introduction, that ultimately should just get the full human pass. So I think this again kind of touches on the human oversight question in our 9 principles, which is trust, I would say, is hard to scale on autopilot. And the bigger the stakes of the message, the smaller the AI's role maybe should be at this stage. And then fourthly, and I think this is probably the step that is overlooked or maybe not as well prioritized within the sector yet, is just feedback your feedback into the system. So if if the tone that it's producing is missing the mark, it's too formal or too generic, whatever, feed it back to it so the next draft is closer, and the 5 minutes of kind of human editing ultimately kind of shrinks over time instead of staying consistent. And I think that's a way that we can really, I would say, kind of get to as close to kind of autopilot as maybe we want to get for something, for a donor communications, and also still kind of keep that trust again as the greatest currency of our age as well.
Right. And that reframing is exactly what the industry needs to hear right now as well. The goal isn't to remove that human step, that human element. The goal is to save time earlier in the process so that the final human review gets more attention and not less. And at Double the Donation, we see also every day how crucial those authentic relationships are when driving corporate matching gifts and employee engagement. Actually, matching gifts, they represent billions in available funding, between $4 to $7 billion, but many teams, they miss out simply because they lack the bandwidth or personalized follow-up. But if we pair that with smart automation like match identification tools with the responsible AI drafting that you just described, we allow corporate partnership managers to spend 80% more of their time actually cultivating relationships rather than doing manual data entry. Katrina, to make sure that teams can actually execute on this without creating massive liabilities, we need to talk about governance. I know that we've kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, but before a fundraising team signs a contract for a new AI tool or starts feeding donor data into an LLM, what is the one non-negotiable sentence that leadership needs to add to their internal data governance policy tomorrow morning?
Yes, I think this is I'll try to keep this one simple, and maybe it's a bit too obvious, but maybe not. I would say the one sentence is that no donor beneficiary data may be entered into an AI tool unless that tool's data handling and retention terms. I mean, there's different compliances that your organization specifically might be abiding by, whether that's HIPAA or GDPR or LGBT in Brazil or PAPIA in South Africa, but ensuring that those have been reviewed and confirmed in writing. So I think the question to ask yourself as an organization is, does the contract with the AI software vendor comply with local, regional, and international or organizational standards for the handling of PII or other sensitive data? That's probably the single most important question that we would align to leadership and needs to be, I would say, within the internal data governance policy. I suppose kind of expanding upon that a little bit, I think written confirmation is also important. I think that has to be kind of the first gate, and it ties again back to our accountability and governance principle. And ultimately, like, someone specific needs to own this check. And we within Vera, we've built we've kind of rolled out AI in a pretty kind of, I would say, maybe not as fast as many other organizations, because we've been quite intentional about how we've rolled it out. And one of the key underlying factors to even starting to do any enablement or selecting any tool or enterprise platform is we established an AI center of excellence within Vera. And ultimately, kind of that center of excellence has roles and responsibilities and are helping to kind of keep the accountability and governance principle in check. And I think it's also it can be a helpful tool for nonprofits, whether it's a smaller nonprofit who is doing a lot and functionally kind of pretty diverse, or a larger nonprofit who has many different teams who are leveraging AI for many different reasons. So certainly kind of another piece of advice that we've heard is helpful for organizations and might help kind of keep that one non-negotiable sentence on track and continuing to kind of propel the organization forward and saving time and using AI for automated purposes, and then hopefully eventually too kind of moving into opportunities to use it for augmentation, which is ultimately, I would say, kind of tapping into AI to think better and using it as a thinking partner, which really excites us as well.
That is very, very credible and actionable advice. Having that someone also like own that sign off, that accountability, as we've been mentioning as well. It moves an organization from reactive damage control to proactive accountability as well. So Katrina, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing Vera Solutions insights on keeping our technology human-centered, secure, and truly impactful. To our listeners, you can find more resources and links to Katrina's work in the show notes. But I know that we've already cut through the AI hype and all those actionable insights. There are people, I would assume, that would want to connect with you or learn more about Vera Solutions. So where should they head?
They can head over to our website. It's verasolutions.org, verasolutions.org, and contact us there. I'll also share, Kathleen, my direct email too. Happy to chat. I mean, ultimately, I think we're all learning, as I imagine is also the case within Double the Donation as well. And we're all learning kind of how we can best leverage these great advances in technology responsibly and ethically. So I think one of the best ways that we can continue to learn is just to continue to connect and find kind of other folks that are in similar situations. So always very happy to chat and just hear where an organization's at and see what we can collectively learn together.
I love that. Huge thank you again, Katrina, for joining us today with your valuable takeaways, and to everyone who's listening. So everyone, keep connecting, keep innovating, and keep boosting your mission. Thank you so much. Bye.
Here's your next steps. Visit doublethedonation.com to explore the tools and strategies that schools and nonprofits use to unlock more revenue through corporate fundraising. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share the video with your team and peers.